I was not supposed to be in that lane. That is the sentence I return to, now that enough years have passed that I can say it without embarrassment. I was not supposed to be in the lane behind the mercer's shop on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with rain coming down the way it does in Aldenmere, not violently, but with a patient, cheerless determination that soaks through wool and resolution in equal measure. I was supposed to be in the warm, dry interior of Ravenscroft Hall, reviewing the estate accounts that my aunt had asked me to inspect before I rode north again. I had been delayed, first by a broken wheel spoke on the road in from Harwick, and then by my own stubborn preference for walking the half-mile from the coaching inn rather than waiting for the repaired carriage like a sensible man. I had my reasons. I have always walked when I need to think, and I had a great deal to think about that October. I did not know her yet. She was, at that moment, simply a figure in a gray wool cloak at the far end of the lane, moving toward me with the focused, purposeful stride of someone who has an errand and intends to complete it in spite of the weather. I paid her no particular attention. I was paying attention to the dog. He was wedged against the culvert at the edge of the lane, where the runnel from the market square came down hard after rain, and the stone lip of the drain made a kind of small, brutal dam. He was not much of a dog, a terrier of no distinguishable breed, sandy-colored and thin, one ear folded wrong, the kind of creature that exists in every market town and belongs formally to no one. He had fallen in, or been pushed, or been swept down from the square, and the current at the drain lip was just enough to hold him, pulling his hindquarters under while he scrabbled at the stone with his front paws and made no sound at all. That silence was what made me stop. A dog that still has strength fights and cries. A dog that has gone quiet is a dog that has given up. I knelt down in the mud. There was no question of not kneeling. The culvert edge was low and slippery, and there was no other way to reach him, and I worked my hands under his chest and lifted him clear. He was heavier than he looked, soaked through, his heart beat fast and thread-like against my palm. I set him on the lane, and he stood for a moment in that shivering, bewildered way of animals who have survived something they didn't fully understand, and then he turned and looked at me with eyes the color of amber in a low fire, and I was, I confess, entirely and helplessly charmed. I did not see her stop. I did not see her at all, in fact, until I straightened and turned and found her standing perhaps 12 feet away, perfectly still in her gray cloak, watching me with an expression I could not read at that distance in the rain. I registered her, young, composed, not alarmed, not smiling. Then I looked down at my mud-covered hands and my ruined coat and the state of my knees, and I said, for want of anything more useful, "He was caught." She said, "I could see that," a pause, "Is he all right?" I looked at the dog, who was now investigating the base of the wall with his nose, apparently recovered. "He seems to have decided he is," I said. She nodded, as though this were a satisfactory report. Then she walked on, past me and the dog and the culvert, continuing her errand with the same purposeful pace, and I watched her for a moment before I realized I was watching her and stopped. I dried off at the coaching inn. I gave a coin to the stable boy and asked him to take the terrier to the south stable at Ravenscroft Hall, where there was a warm corner and a competent groom, and no particular rule against one more dog. Then I walked to the hall and changed my coat, and spent the evening in a perfectly ordinary fashion, reading dispatch correspondence from my man of affairs in London. I did not think about her again until the following morning. She was standing in my aunt's drawing room, holding a list of household accounts, and wearing the expression of someone who is listening very carefully to a great deal of information, and filing it in good order. My aunt, Lady Ferreth, was speaking at her usual pace, which is to say rapidly, and in a direction that bore only a loose relationship to the question she had begun with. The young woman, Wren Alcott, I would learn, recently engaged as my aunt's companion after the death of the previous holder of that position, was nodding at intervals with a precision that suggested she had already identified which parts of the speech were load-bearing and which were ornament. I stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed me. My aunt said, with the particular brightness she reserved for moments she expected to be awkward, "Edmund, you are early. Miss Alcott, my nephew, the Duke of Ravenscroft." She said my title the way people say the name of a large and unpredictable piece of weather. Miss Alcott looked up. She went entirely, carefully still. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she dropped a correct curtsy, said, "Your Grace," and returned her attention to the household list, and nothing in her face or her posture gave anything away. She was, I noted, rather good at not giving things away. I was rather good at it myself. I recognized the skill the way you recognize a mirror. I said something to my aunt, something about the wheel spoke and the journey, and took a chair near the window and opened my correspondence. And over the following quarter of an hour I was aware, without looking up, that Miss Alcott was aware of me in a way that had nothing to do with deference or anxiety. She was watching me the way you watch a sum that isn't adding up. There was no rudeness in it. She simply could not, I suspected, reconcile what she was looking at with what she already knew. I had the same problem in reverse. I spent 4 days at Ravenscroft Hall. They were productive days. The accounts were in reasonable order. A drainage issue on the west field had been overestimated. The cook needed a new copper pot and had been requesting it for 8 months without anyone acting on it. And in the intervals between these practical matters, I developed a thorough, involuntary catalogue of Wren Alcott's habits. She rose before my aunt. She walked in the walled garden before breakfast regardless of weather, not for pleasure, I thought, but because she needed the quarter hour of silence before a day of being useful. She read in the evenings by the smaller fire in the east sitting room rather than the drawing room, with the particular absorption of someone to whom reading is not recreation but oxygen. She was kind to the housemaids in a way that was not performed. She simply noticed them, spoke to them directly, remembered their names and used them. She had a habit when she was thinking of touching the tip of her left forefinger to the inside of her wrist, barely a movement at all. She visited the south stable twice. I knew because the groom told me, unprompted, with the mild pride of someone delivering good news. "Your Miss Alcott came to see the dog, Your Grace." He had apparently accepted her as belonging to the household within approximately a day. Animals and servants, in my experience, are the best judges of character available. She had not mentioned the lane. Not once in 4 days. Not to me, not to my aunt. I would have heard about it from my aunt, who had a gift for repeating things she had been told in confidence, not from malice but from an inability to believe that anything interesting should be kept to fewer than 3 people. Whatever Miss Alcott had seen in that lane, she was keeping it to herself. I found I wanted very much to know why. On the 4th evening it rained again, properly this time, with thunder rolling in from the north coast and the windows going dark by 5 o'clock. My aunt retired early with her headache. I went to the library because that is where I go when I have no good reason to go anywhere. Miss Alcott was already there, in the chair nearest the lamp, with a volume of natural history open on her knee and her finger at her left wrist. She looked up when I entered. I said, "Don't stop on my account," which was not what I had planned to say. I had not planned to say anything. I had intended to take a book from the shelf and read in companionable silence, and not, under any circumstances, conduct a conversation about a Tuesday afternoon in October. "I wasn't going to," she said, and returned to her book. I stood at the shelves for perhaps a minute, reading the same 3 titles repeatedly, without retaining any of them. Then I said, "Was it you in the lane on Tuesday?" She looked up again. There was something almost like relief in her face, the relief of someone who has been waiting for a question and is glad it has finally been asked so the waiting can stop. "Yes," she said. "You didn't say." "No," she agreed, "you didn't either." This was a fair point. I took it as such. I found the book I had not actually been looking for and sat in the chair across the fire from her and opened it without reading it. "I have been trying," she said after a moment, to fit you into two different accounts. And she set down her natural history. She had, I noticed, the composure of someone who has been overlooked in enough rooms that she has learned to say what she thinks without performing it. There was no strategy in it, no charm, just the statement. "The man in the lane," she said, "and the Duke of Ravenscroft. I cannot seem to put them together." "They are the same man," I said. "I know that," she said. "I know that now. But I knew one of them before I had a name for him, and the name is," she paused, looking for the word, "very loud." I understood this precisely. I had lived behind the loudness of the name for nearly 2 decades. I had, in fact, cultivated the loudness deliberately, because it was efficient. A man whom people fear is a man who is not constantly required to explain himself. I had not realised, until this moment, that I minded it as much as I apparently did. "The man in the lane," I said, "is not something I generally advertise." "I didn't think so," she said, "which is why I didn't say." I looked at her, she looked at me. The fire shifted, a log settled. Outside, the rain hit the windows in long, swept gusts. "Why," I said, "why didn't you say?" Most people would have said. Most people would have considered it useful. She seemed to think about this seriously, which I appreciated. She did not rush to an answer. When it came, it was simple. "Because I thought you might prefer to be known the right way round." The right way round. The mud and the dog first, the title second, the man before the Duke. I had been known the wrong way round my entire life, introduced first as the title, the estate, the consequence, and allowed to be a human being somewhere far down the list if time permitted. I had managed this by becoming genuinely difficult, which at least had the merit of honesty. It had not, until Tuesday, occurred to me that anyone might simply choose to know me differently. I said more quietly than I intended, "That was generous." "It seemed only fair," she said. "You didn't know I was watching." "No," I said, "I didn't." "So it was the true version," she said. "I thought the true version deserved the better order." I cannot account for what happened to me in that moment, except to say that something in the very efficient structure I had built, stone by careful stone, over 38 years, encountered the sentence "the true version deserved the better order," and was no longer entirely sound. I did not show it. I was, as I have said, experienced in not showing things. But I felt it, the way you feel a thing shift in a building during a storm, not collapsing, not even cracking, but settling into a new position from which it cannot return to the old one. The terrier, I should mention, was doing well. The groom had named him Tuesday, which I found both accurate and somewhat pointed. He had already developed an opinion about the copper water dish and had communicated it by tipping it over twice. I had given instructions that he was to have whatever dish he preferred, and that my aunt's cook was not to argue with him about the meat scraps. These instructions had been received with exactly as much solemnity as they deserved. Miss Alcott knew his name. She had been to see him that morning as well. He was looking better, she said when I mentioned this. He had couleur in his gums. He was eating. He was, I agreed. You checked his gums, she said. It was not a question. I did. She smiled. It was not a large smile. She was not, I was learning, a large gesture person, but it reached her eyes in the way that matters, the way that tells you the smile is about something real rather than something performed. It lasted only a moment before she recovered her composure, but I had seen it, and I held on to it with both hands. I rode north at the end of the week as I had always intended. I shook my aunt's hand, we are not an embracing family, and told the groom that Miss Alcott was to be afforded the use of the bay mare whenever she wished to ride, which was an instruction I had no particular authority to give and gave anyway. I did not, that morning, say anything to Miss Alcott that was not entirely correct and appropriate. I thanked her for her assistance with the household accounts, which she had been extremely helpful with. She thanked me for my observations on the drainage. We were both very professional about it. I was in HARWICK by midday, and in my study in the city by the following evening. And I spent 3 weeks being highly productive, and not thinking about a gray wool cloak in a rain-soaked lane, and then I rode back to Aldenmere. I told my aunt I had come to review the Westfield drainage in person, which was true. I told my man of affairs I had concerns about the kitchen accounts, which were also true. I told myself, the whole length of the road, that these were the reasons. She was in the walled garden when I arrived, walking her quarter hour before breakfast. She heard my horse on the drive and turned, and I saw clearly, at 40 yards, the moment she recognized me, and the moment after that when she decided to take it in her stride. I dismounted. I walked to the garden gate. I said, I thought I should look at the drainage. It rained heavily last week, she said. The lower path is soft. I'll note that, I said. She looked at me for a moment, this careful, composed, perceptive woman who had met me in the right order and given me the courtesy of keeping it. Then she said, Tuesday is in the kitchen this morning. He stole a piece of bread from the rack and the cook has had a great deal to say about it. I'll speak to the cook, I said. She'll tell you he is the most opinionated dog she has ever encountered. He has an excellent character, I said. He simply knows what he wants. She held my gaze for a moment, and there was something in her expression, a quietness, a particular steadiness, that I recognized as the same quality I had seen in that lane, when she had looked at the man in the mud and simply registered him, without alarm or performance, as though what he was doing was entirely reasonable. As though a man who knelt in the rain for a drowning creature was not strange at all, but simply a man worth knowing. I think he does, she said, and she walked with me through the garden gate. We were married the following April, in the village church at Aldenmere, with my aunt and 6 others in the pews and Tuesday sitting in the aisle with a proprietary air, as though the whole business had been his idea. Wren wore a gown the color of winter sky, and I wore my best coat, and when the vicar said the words and I took her hand, I thought of a Tuesday afternoon in October and a woman in a gray cloak who had looked at the truest thing she would ever see of me, and kept it. She told me once, years later, when we had been long enough married that the telling was easy, that she had known in the lane. Not who I was, that came after, but what I was. She said the rest had been simply a matter of waiting to see if I already knew it myself. I told her she had been very patient. She said she had not been patient at all. She said she had been certain, which is a different thing. And she put her hand in mine the way she had been putting her hand in mine for years, without ceremony and without the least hesitation in the world, and the walled garden was full of late roses, and I did not have a single, solitary thing to add.